Hello and welcome to part B of the Module 1 recording. Obviously there's a lot to talk about in the first week, so I've decided to sort of split the videos, and this one is going to focus on the reading material for this week, which I spoke very briefly about in the last video, but I thought it's worth going through some more details here to get you started. Now, the first thing about these videos when it comes to the readings, a very important thing here is that the videos do not replace the readings. We're not going to summarize the readings for you. We're not going to, just talk about what's in the readings in detail, because otherwise there'd be no point in doing the readings. And the other thing is, reading is a much faster way to get information in rather than listening to someone talk about it. So just getting that out of the way to start with, that you will still need to do the readings even though we're going to talk about them. We're not going to sit there and summarize all the details that you need to know. All right, so this first module, obviously there's 3 chapters covered, but they're 3 very, very introductory chapters, and we get into the meat of the subject soon after. And I might just talk through each of the 3 and make some observations and give you some pointers of what sort of things to look for and what sort of things to focus on. So let's start off with number 1. Chapter 1, The Life of a Lawyer. This introduces the concept of thinking like a lawyer, and that's going to be an important concept throughout this term. And it's something that's important not just for the law students, but also for the criminology students and for anyone who uses or works within the legal system, justice system, bureaucratic systems, government systems. Because there's a certain way of thinking, a certain way of approaching regulation. And one of the roles of this unit is to help you understand what that way of thinking is, and understand how you then engage with those systems and how you actually make a particular argument to get what you want out of that system. So I think that's one of the problems a lot of self-represented litigants have with the legal system, is they come along thinking, obviously inspired by TV and movies, that it's all about an appeal to justice. That what you're going to court is, as you say, it isn't fair, I've got a claim, I think I've been hard done by, please help me out. And that's not how the law works. And largely that happens, the reason that doesn't work is because most litigation involves a conflict between 2 people or more. And usually both parties think they're hard done by. Usually both parties think the other is in the wrong. So it actually isn't much of an argument to say, I feel like I've been wronged. I feel like I deserve justice, because there's going to be someone who's going to feel just as much that way, rightly or wrongly. So when we talk about thinking like a lawyer, it's about thinking in terms of legal principles, in terms of evidence, and making a structured argument around those principles. And they're the sort of things we're going to introduce this term. And I think that what we can start doing is getting rid of some of those myths around what it is. And then the chapter does talk about those things. That's worth looking at. Some of those myths around what lawyers do, but also what the law actually is. And why is law so focused on technical principles? Well, it's because they're dealing with complex conflicts and complex situations where those principles are designed to try and sort of sort out those competing claims. Okay, the chapter then goes on to talk about different career paths. It's still very, very narrow, I must admit. The chapter doesn't really acknowledge the breadth of career paths in law, let alone the other folks out there who are not going into a legal career path at all. So I guess part of the problem is we don't know a lot about the destination of law graduates. The only really the most reliable data we have comes from the graduate surveys that the government does a year out, I think, and 5 years out from graduation, and they ask people a variety of things, including whether they're in full-time employment. Now, those surveys are obviously got a weakness in that not everyone responds to the surveys, so that's a weakness. But and they show that law graduates tend to be employed 1 year out, 5 years out. They have high employability. Criminology graduates are pretty strong as well in those fields. It doesn't tell you where those people are working, whether they're working as advocates before the International Court of Human Rights or they're, working in the local Safeway. So universities like to promote these data and say, 85% of our graduates are in full employment, but it's better than saying, I guess it's better than saying 30% of our graduates are in full employment, really, isn't it? But it doesn't tell us very much. And the last really reliable study of law career destinations was done by University of Melbourne in the early 2000s. And that being a big prestigious sandstone university, what they found was quite surprising, was that only about 10 to 20% of law graduates actually, from their program, actually worked in the law. That the vast majority of law graduates, and while they were all largely employed, were not working in the law itself. And since that time, the legal profession has been shrinking, and the number of graduates has been expanding. So what that means is if your career goal, if you're one of the law students whose career goal is to be a lawyer, work in a law office, work in the courts, the competition is very, very stiff, and you're going to need to do really well. And you're not only going to need to do well academically, you're going to have your experience, your volunteering, your extracurriculars, all those things lined up. Now that sounds daunting, and it is daunting, and that's something we can return to as a theme in this course. But it's a tough objective if you want to go that path. On the other hand, we do know that most of those law graduates from that survey are working somewhere. But we don't know a lot about what they do. And my intuition is that as societies become more complex and more highly regulated, there is more and more need for people who have systems knowledge, who can work with systems. And whether it's someone who works in regulation and compliance and is constantly, looking to, working for, say, a business or an NGO where they need to comply with a whole lot of government regulation, or even just working in an ordinary organisation where you've got to be, organise payroll and work contracts and all those sorts of things. A lot of jobs are sort of saturated by this legal regulatory approach, and I think that's where a lot of law graduates are going. They're going into these diverse career paths where once maybe you'd employ a business graduate and say, you're working in business, we'll get a business graduate. There's now enough law graduates that'll say, well, I can have a business graduate or a law graduate. I'll take the law graduate. Now, criminology, similar, obviously not got the same prestige as a law qualification, but I think the ability to work with and understand systems and the confidence of working with systems gives those people a career boost and gives them the ability to say, well, my background's in criminal justice, however, you're dealing with safety regulation and compliance. It's similar transferable skills. So anyway, the textbook is pretty weak on careers, and it tends to say, oh, well, you can be a lawyer, or you can be a lawyer, or you can be a lawyer, and the evidence just isn't there. Okay, the evidence says that people with law degrees go in lots of directions, but we don't have very good evidence of where they go. So, interesting puzzle to think about. How would you track that? Particularly because people don't have to respond to surveys when you send them. All right. So, there's there's a significant number of comedians have a law background. So there you go. There's one that's not mentioned in the book. All right. The first chapter also talks a little bit around the idea of getting experience. Now that ties into the other video on the portfolios for this unit and the idea of the portfolio more generally, and again, theme to bring up that, and I know this is also the point where there's a danger of you feeling very overwhelmed by everything, and you may have been thinking, oh look, all I can do, I can spare a few hours a week, I can get a qualification, I can get a degree, that'll get me a job. And it's very disappointing to have someone on a video then tell you, well, actually that's not going to be good enough. So let's suspend that discussion until a little later, till you're feeling a little less overwhelmed, but let's keep that somewhere on the agenda, that idea that employers have a lot of graduates to choose from. They're looking for something more than just someone with good marks. And in fact, they're very suspicious of someone who has nothing but good marks. That's a bit of a warning sign. And, let's, as I said, we'll put a pin in it for later discussion. And the other topic that comes up in that first module is professional identity and the importance, and this is connected to those experiences, that idea of building a professional identity right from the very beginning. Again, the portfolio is a big part of that, but it also involves things like being really diligent about academic misconduct, knowing what the rules are, not breaching those rules, because that becomes very important for people who, it's important for everyone, but lawyers are required to report if they've ever been investigated for misconduct, let alone, punished for misconduct. And that's often around issues like plagiarism. Now, we're going to talk about that a little later in the course. But if someone even accuses you of plagiarism as a law student, you have to report that when you go for admission. And the admitting authority are entitled to say no. Sorry, you've spent all these years and all this money getting a law degree, but that first year unit in which you were accused of, copying an assignment, I've never heard of them actually, refusing to admit someone on the basis of an accusation that was never proven. But it does happen when there are proven accusations, and they're entitled to do that. So there's all things around professional identity and character that are very important for lawyers. Less so for criminologists, but then again, even if you're a criminologist, someone can search your Facebook page and find the awful things that you posted and the awful things that you said and did when you were sort of 14 years old, and thought it was really, really funny to do something that was outrageous and scandalous. And we're beginning to start to get those generations go into the workforce, and people who are then got that problem of, well, how do you deal with this past identity that you've accrued? And one of the things you really need to do now is build a professional social media profile and start fresh with a new identity. Don't mix up your work and your so if you've got Facebook, create a Facebook that's a professional one, that doesn't have any holiday pics and doesn't have any memes that you post or jokes or whatever. Keep your family one for your family. Keep the professional one separate. All those sorts of things. So again, a topic to return to, but it is something that again, employers will search for your social media, and if they find there's sort of like 2 months of social media on your Facebook, they're going to be suspicious and look further. So if you can start building now at least a few years of professional activities and those sort of things, it does look better. All right, let's jump to chapter 2, which is about fundamental legal concepts. One of the best parts of that chapter that I would recommend is the call-out box on the Hart-Devlin debate. That's a really interesting issue that's been sort of very core to legal thought, and that's talking about, what are the objectives of law and to what extent can law pursue moral objectives. And the debate when Hart and Devlin were talking about was all about sexual morality. It was around homosexuality, prostitution, sexual misconduct, and all these sort of things that at the time the liberal-minded people were saying, well, is it the law's role to interfere in people's personal lives? If no one's being hurt, everything's consensual, why is the law being involved? Now, curiously enough, the debate has shifted today in terms of things like, the Me Too movement, in terms of hate crime, and in terms of different areas where we're looking at whether law is the appropriate way to enforce social values. But the politics have shifted quite significantly. I mean, in the Hart-Devlin time, the Conservatives were pro legal enforcement. They wanted the law to be in everyone's bedrooms, regulating everything they do. Whereas today, the Conservatives want the law out of people's lives and say, hey, if I want to dress up as a Nazi on the weekend, not that all Conservative people dress up as Nazis, I don't mean that, but if you want to, whatever you want to do on your weekend and whatever you want to say on your Facebook page, there shouldn't be any penalty for that. You should be free to do whatever you want. The law shouldn't interfere. And you've actually got the liberal side of the debate now turning around and saying, oh no, we need to be able to scrutinise and regulate what people do. So have a look at the Hart-Devlin debate question and have a think about how things have changed, and how today largely we're in a situation where it's not the people who, it's not queer people who are necessarily being penalised by legal restrictions, but it's now the homophobic people who are now facing legal restrictions or contractual restrictions and consequences of their actions. Is that progress? Is that different? Or is it the same argument again and again? So something to think about. Now, the rest of Chapter 2 kind of zooms you through a history of legal thought and how legal thought connects to philosophy. That's a theme we will return to. Just make notes of some of the key ideas and key theories as you go through, particularly the liberal legal theories, because that's going to come back into the workshop this week. And, you know, just the word cannibalism is always a fun one to talk about in a law workshop. But the problem question in this week's workshop is really about whether something which is fundamentally unthinkable, fundamentally something the law would not tolerate, such as cannibalism, are there circumstances in which that, you know, is permissible or acceptable? Obviously, it's an extreme example used for the purpose of illustrating the debate. So, you know, it's not really a practical application of what you're learning. You're unlikely to, I hope, you're unlikely to bump into cannibalism in your professional career, really. But it's a deliberately extreme argument in order to have you start thinking about, well, what is the law? What does it do? What are the limits of legal regulation? And then the third chapter is a history of Australian law. Now, I'm not a legal historian. I'm someone who, you know, is very interested in history, but I often find the law's obsession with history to be rather strange. Quite often, these introduction to law sort of courses will often be sort of 2/3 chapter 3 and going through all the different, you know, things that have happened in the legal system and the creation of equity and the split of equity in common law and the Colonial Laws Acts and the reception of law. Look, I think you can skim through that. What's important in that chapter, of course, is that it foregrounds the legal heritage of the Indigenous Australians, that Australia was not a legally inert place when the European colonisers came, that there was pre-existing law, and that we are in a continual struggle over the recognition of those legal systems, as you do have in any time when, you know, one group of colonisers conquers another and then imposes their law. To what extent can they impose that law? To what extent does the previous law continue? All very, very big issues, and something that we're not going to really deal with in one chapter of a textbook, but just flag those for something to look at later on. But if you're finding a bit lost in the, you know, the history of British law and colonial law and all the rest of it, don't worry too much. I'd skim through that. Just make a note of what the major themes are and things like what is equity, what is common law. For me, the key question of this chapter, and it's not one the chapter addresses directly, is the concept of rule of law. Now, rule of law it talks about the rule of law, not men. Men meaning people, so the rule of law, not individuals. And a lot of our legal system is actually a response to what came before it. So if you think about what came before the idea of a centralised state legal system, what you had was rule by chieftains and rule often by warlords who were the strongest of the chieftains, and they could do what they wanted to do because they were the strongest. And the evolution of the law has all been about the creation of a civil society where you don't have to be strong to make decisions, where sovereignty is vested in the people, and that decisions are made on a way that's fair and accessible to everyone. So a lot of when we look at legal history and we go, well, what is the point of that idea of common law and precedent? What is the idea of the separation of powers? All those things we're going to return to again and again in this term. I think one useful way to think about it is to think, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative where you have, you know, the guy with the biggest stick, the strongest guy with the biggest stick, deciding what the law is? Our legal system has evolved in a way to try and stop that happening. Although we still have a problem with it's like not the person with the biggest stick, but the person sitting on the biggest pile of money that often has the ability to, you know, shape rights and define the way in which law operates. So we still have that inequality problem. It's just it's moved to a different arena. But it is something that is becoming an issue in the news, and we see again and again reference to rule of law and the attacks on rule of law by particularly the expanse of executive power, particularly the idea that elected representatives can start gathering more powers that are not regulated by law. And the two classic and shockingly similar examples of this from American politics are Donald Trump and Barack Obama, both of which have used executive powers in ways that are deeply non-democratic, in ways that defy rule of law. And you wouldn't think you'd put those two presidents in the same box in any situation, but in many ways a lot of the abuses of executive power by the Obama administration, particularly executive kill orders and drone kills and all those things that really should have been supervised through the parliamentary process, through Congress, has opened the way for someone like Trump, who just doesn't seem to understand or really care about rule of law, and again uses those executive powers. And we've seen examples in Australia as well. So if you think that legal history is something that's kind of dead and gone and not relevant, it's something that's coming back to us now. And we are facing from both sides of politics these unprecedented attacks on democracy and these attempts to try and say, well, I've been elected as the head of the executive, be it a president or a prime minister, I can do whatever I want. I don't have to follow the law. And that's something that we should all be concerned about. Okay, we'll talk about more these issues again in the workshop.